Howdy bubs and welcome back. Today we're going to be jumping back into Game Maker to continue work on our enemy. Today we're going to add in a couple of new parts, all associated with making sure that our enemy, when we hit them and eventually they die, for the enemy to have a proper death animation. We don't want to just destroy the enemy. We want to, at least in our case, for the enemy to record what direction they were hit from and swap objects to a dying version where the object will fly opposite of the direction that they were hit from and end up lying on the ground. So let's go ahead and jump into the code to see what we have to do to facilitate that. Down in our O projectile, I'm going to do two things. First, because I don't want to take forever, I'm going to increase my damage to 5 just for the time being. You can play around with that. I'll probably end up leaving it here. Again, your game, your goal, you can decide how much damage you want to do. The other thing I'm going to do is add in an attribute hit from is equal to other dot direction. What this is going to do is create an attribute, a property, for our other object, whatever we were shooting at. Once they get hit, in our case it's anything targetable, so right now the box or my enemy, and it records what direction the projectile was going. We can then move over to the sprites. This is what I have created for my enemy sprite. There are 2 frames. This is the first frame. The first frame tells us what the enemy sprite looks like when they are flying. We've hit them, they fly for a couple of frames, and when they land on the floor, they look like this. This is what I have done. For your program to work with my existing code, you should do something similar. 1 frame for them flying, and then 1 frame for them landing on the ground. Now let's jump into our enemy object. Over here in our events, we're going to add a new event. This will be our begin step. In here, we're going to check to see if the enemy is dead. Check and draw dead enemy. So, if our hit points are less than or equal to 0, you always want to do a less than rather than just checking directly 0, because what if the enemy has 2 health, you've hit them with 3 damage, their health is now -1. If you're checking for exactly 0, it's going to miss that. If you check for less than or equal to 0, it would catch that. So, with that, we can now say we're going to create a new instance. With instance underscore create in the same layer, in our X position, our Y position, our current layer, I'm going to create a enemy object for enemy dead. We don't have this object yet, we're going to create it in a bit, but this is going to be the code that will apply all of the information so it knows what direction it should be flying in. The direction that we are flying in is simply going to be other dot hit from. This is what we were checking earlier with our projectile. Whenever the projectile hits a targetable item, it records where it got hit from last. Well, the direction that our enemy is going to be flying in is going to be based off of that value. Then horizontal speed is going to be equal to the length and direction of x, and I'll say 3. You can mess around with that number. That's essentially how far they're flying initially when they get hit. And direction. Then vertical speed is equal to length and direction in y, 3 pixels once again, and then direction -3. This extra -3 is just to show, I guess, a little bit more force. So wherever they get hit from, if I'm shooting them from the left, it'll record it and keep track of it, and it'll move it 3 pixels in the general right direction. If we're shooting them from slightly below or slightly above, it'll have a little bit of weight added to it from our respective direction. But I'm also adding a little bit more to force our enemy, when we shoot them, to fly up just a bit. Now, if our enemy is being shot at from directly above it, it's not going to end up moving, because if we're directly above, 3 minus 3 is 0. but this will ensure that we get a slight upward movement. And then finally, our image underscore x scale is going to be equal to other dot level times sine of our horizontal speed times 0.5. The 0.5 is actually the scaling that we had with the other level, and then the sine of the horizontal speed just lets us know which direction it's going. Our y scale, image underscore y scale, is equal to other dot image underscore y scale. The y scale shouldn't change at all, so we're just grabbing the other image. We instance underscore destroy to destroy the enemy object, since we are now switching over to the dead enemy now. But what is enemy dead? That is going to be the new object we're going to create using the sprite I showed off earlier. So let's go ahead and right click, create new object. Now this will be enemy dead. Let me make sure I throw this into my enemies group. Select the correct sprite. This will be under enemies, and this will be enemy astronaut dead is what I've called mine. And before we add in any events, let's make sure our collision mask is the same as our standing enemy. Now we should be good to create two events. We're going to have a create event, and we're going to have a step event. Let me go ahead and maximize this so we can focus on them. So over in our create event, we're going to just be initializing values. And over here we're going to have our gravity acceleration is simply equal to 0.3. Are we done with our whole flying animation and hitting the ground? Initially it is false, of course. And we're going to set our image speed is equal to 0. Now remember, the image speed is tied to how I'm having simply 2 frames. One for whenever it's flying, one for whenever it lands on the ground. If instead you want to have an animated sprite for it falling, you might have to do a little bit of extra code to swap between sprites and maybe have a separate sprite for whenever they've made collision with the ground. And last, I'm going to go ahead and add in a screen shake each time we kill the enemy. So we're going to just have a magnitude of 6, and it's going to shake for 30 frames. Now that we have done everything here in initializing, let's go ahead into our step event, and this will handle falling and our final position. So if we are not done, then we of course have our gravity, we have our movement collision check, and if we are standing on an O wall and our vertical speed is equal to 0, then we are now done with our little animation. Once we are done with that, we simply have our image index set to 1. So long as I'm not done, we have gravity, we're doing movement collision checks, and if we finally find ourselves standing on a wall and our vertical speed is now 0, then we mark it as done. If we're done, then that means this condition will be false. We'll move to the else, and we'll swap our image index from 0, the first frame, to 1, the second frame. Now, with this set up, we should be able to jump into the game and see if our enemies react accordingly. And there we go. I go ahead and get this bottom one, take a shot at him in the other direction, and we see he flies back and lands. And if I can hit the one above, you'll see that from the downward angle, he'll fly up slightly more than the others have whenever they were hit. And there we go. He flew up a decent bit more than the others did whenever they were hit. And that's all we needed in order to get our enemies to now have a death animation. If you have any questions or need any assistance in class, just let me know. Otherwise, that's all I have for you today. Everyone, have a good one. I just wanted to say thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Shout out to my bad bubs, my top 5, my day ones. Y'all have always been there for me. Next up, my baby bubs, the next 5. I always love y'all's support. And finally, for everyone else, any little bit helps. Thank you to all my basic bubs for supporting me along my journey. If you want to continue receiving notifications, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell button.